I don't usually do this kind of thing, but I'd fallen behind in my studies. I've always been an honor roll student. I had some B's here and there, but mostly fantastic grades. I wasn't big into extracurricular activities, but I was a library assistant, and I did a little volunteer work for the required hours I needed to graduate. That all changed when I turned 17. My parents had gotten me a car for my birthday. Nothing fancy, but 4 wheels and an engine is always nice. But it came with a caveat. If I wanted to drive it, I needed to pay the insurance on it. This led me to pick up a job, which led to a lot of closing shifts at my local fast food chain and not a lot of time for studying or doing homework. So when Mr. Castleberry told me I was going to fail 12th grade English if I didn't bring my grades up, I asked him if there wasn't something we could do to work this out. I admit extra credit, maybe a makeup assignment or retake a test, but it seemed he had other ideas. He looked around as if what we were going to talk about was likely to get him in trouble, and then he scribbled something on a piece of paper and handed it to me. When I asked him what it was, he told me to open it when I got to my car, not to tell anybody. He refused to say anything else about it after that, and as I sat in the front seat of my car reading the message, I was a little weirded out. I mean, you saw these sorts of situations in adult films or in the back of Hustler magazines, but you really never thought it would happen in real life. Meet me at my house at 7:30, before sunset. Be prepared to stay till dawn. I started to go back in and tell him there was no way in hell, but I needed this particular class to graduate. Who knows, maybe he just liked to hang out with his students in the middle of the night. I didn't believe that for a second, but I decided that it was worth looking into. If I wasn't comfortable with it, I could always take the bad grade and figure something else out. It worked out pretty good because I was off that night, and Mr. Castleberry lived about 15 minutes from my house. I pulled up outside his house at about 7:15 and saw him peeking out the curtains as I came up to knock. He threw the door open, looking around as if to see if I'd been followed, and then practically pulled me inside by the front of my shirt as he closed and locked the door. He threw about 4 different locks, as well as a chain, and then told me to follow him to the bedroom. I raised an eyebrow. This was a little fast, but I did as he asked and figured we would talk over the particulars once we got there. When I stepped into the bedroom, I noticed that Mr. Castleberry had an odd setup. His bed sat in the middle of a circle that I had a sneaking suspicion might be silver. The walls were covered in holy symbols, and Mr. Castleberry was finishing a circle of salt around the bed as I took it all in. He pursed his lips, clearly not sure how to begin, and sat down on the bed as he tried to figure out how to explain. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to be quick. I have a demon inside me, a demon that only comes out after sunset. Bull, I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his face was stone cold serious. Hand of God. That's what the circle and the salt is for. I have people I know who come and sit with me and make sure the demon doesn't escape somehow. But sometimes I have to ask my students to stand in. I just need you to sit here and watch me until dawn. After that, you'll have your A. I sighed, thinking this over. It appeared he didn't want anything sexual, but he was certainly after something weird. Mr. Castleberry had always seemed like such a normal guy. Who would have thought he was clearly some kind of weirdo who thought he was possessed by a demon or something? Whatever, I thought. An A was an A, and I needed to pass the class. Okay, so what do I do if this thing gets out? Mr. Castleberry was getting comfy in bed. There's a box beside your chair. Use what's in there. The gun is a last resort. The bullets in it are very expensive, so I hope you're a good shot. Don't call the police and don't invite anyone over. You got that? I nodded, reaching down beside the chair and finding the box as he got comfortable. Good. Sun's going down, so it won't be long. Oh, the demon will try to tempt you. Just make sure you don't listen to anything he has to say. There's earplugs in the box, but I don't recommend you use anything electronic to block him out. Why not? I asked, taking a battered old Bible and cross out of the box. The gun inside was a heavy old revolver, and It looked like it would blow a hole through a barn if I used it. There were earplugs, a spray bottle labeled HW that I assumed would hurt the demon too. When Mr. Castleberry didn't answer, I asked him again as I looked up. He was lying on the bed, arms crossed over his chest as he mouthed the words to a prayer I didn't know. He was speaking in Latin or Spanish or something, and as the sun got lower, he seemed to be fighting to finish it. His tongue was getting heavy, his words growly, and he was twitching like an epileptic. As the sun slid down the horizon and true dark overtook the town, his eyes popped open, and I heard a sound like someone popping all their vertebrae at once. He roared like a charging rhino, and his body contorted on the bed like someone being flayed alive. I jumped as he writhed on the bed, knocking over the chair as I went for the door. I needed to call the hospital. This was beyond a joke. He needed help. "No!" Mr. Castleberry forced out. "Don't leave. Stay till dawn. Only wait." But that appeared to be all I would get from Mr. Castleberry. He went limp then, falling back on the bed as a soft and satisfying growl left him. As he lay there, I watched as his chest rose and fell. What was going on with him? Was he actually possessed? I shook that thought off. I had been raised Catholic, but the older I got, the less sure I was that God even existed. If there was no God, then there was no devil, so there were no demons either. That meant that the school board was just letting someone like Mr. Castleberry teach kids with whatever mental illness he had going on, probably schizophrenia or multiple personalities or something. I didn't know, but if I had to stay here all night to get an A, then I supposed I would. I was going to be tired at work tomorrow, but I had Sunday off, so I could always recuperate then.
Ah, yes. The Sabbath is a good day to rest. It was good enough for the Almighty, at least. So I suppose it's good enough for you, too. I felt my breath stick in my throat. The voice I had heard from the bed had been as different from Mr. Castleberry's as sandpaper was to velvet. Whoever was talking sounded like the kind of people who do the kind of ASMRs that get you banned on YouTube. It was the kind of voice that lures kids into wells, kind of voice that lures women away from happy marriages, kind of voice that leaves men questioning their sexuality. I looked up to find Mr. Castleberry reclined on the bed, his head resting on his hand in what was likely supposed to be a seductive pose. His eyes were smoldering, something I hadn't thought them capable of, and his smile was predatory. He was sizing me up like a predator preparing to spring, and I felt my skin erupt in goosebumps. Mr. Castleberry? It laughed, and I felt like I should join it, but forced myself not to. The old man has gone to bed, but you can talk to me if you want. My name is Satan. I scoffed. No way in hell. I'm sure Satan has better things to do than bother my English teacher. Very astute. The Spanish girl he brought in last time screamed and ran out of the room when I told her that. I see you have a thicker skin, though. You may call me Raish, and what may I call you? I started to tell him, but I seemed to remember something about telling a demon your name and decided not to give him my real name. Sam, I said, earning a wide, toothy grin from the imp. Astute and cagey. I like that. So how about you break that salt circle and let me out? I'm sure we could have some fun before this old fuddy-duddy gets up. Wouldn't the silver hold you inside too? I asked dubiously. Raish peeked over the bed and chuckled. That crafty old duck. Who knew he could afford that much silver on a teacher's budget? Well, no matter. If you step inside the circle, breaking it with your foot, then it isn't a circle, and I can come out. Come on. What do you say? Found myself considering it. I had actually prepared to stand up when I realized what I was doing. I didn't really know anything about this creature, a change my mind had made from mental disease to creature, and I was just going to trust him? No, I didn't think so. I planted my bottom and shook my head. I don't think so, I said, and was surprised to find that I was almost apologetic. Ray shrugged. Of course not. Why would you release me for free? Why wouldn't you want to get something out of this after all? So what is it you want? What is this old man offering you to keep watch over me? I floundered, finally deciding on the truth. An A in his English class. It sounded lame, and when Raish laughed, I knew he had thought so too. A meaningless mark of completion. I could make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. Get you any one person, any 12 people you desire, or set you up in such a way that not graduating from school would be the least of your worries. I could do so much for you, and I don't even need to take your soul. I just need you to free me. It's been so long since I was free to roam the night, and I'm so very hungry. He had been weaving a spell around me, drawing me into his promises, but at last brought me back to my senses. What would this thing do if it got loose? Who would it hurt if it was just allowed to roam the night? I shook my head, trying to get the invasive words out of my skull, and when I turned back, Mr. Castleberry, or Raish, or whoever he was, looked disappointed. A pity. I really could have done more for you than this old stick. I ignored him after that, though he did not return the favor. I'd brought some books so I could work on my homework, but he was talking too much for me to concentrate. I spent a few hours trying to complete my geometry homework while he offered to help, offered to give me the answers, offered to do things I'd rather not think about, and 100 other such offers. He also threatened me, offered 1,000 different punishments for not letting him out, only to walk them back a moment later and apologize. I checked my watch as I finally closed the book and discovered it was only 10:30. I'd been at this for 3 hours and didn't seem to be going by quickly. Only 8 more hours till sunrise, he said, guessing the source of my sighs. Plenty of time for you to change your mind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the earplugs, pushing them in and taking my American history homework out. 2 hours of mostly silence later, I put it away and looked up to find Raish looking at me a little too intently. I yawned, getting sleepy as I pulled out my phone and scrolled through TikTok. I couldn't hear it, and as I reached for my headphones, I remembered what Mr. Castleberry had said. He had warned me about using electronic headphones, but I figured one probably would be fine. Besides, they had noise reduction on them. That had to count for something. Raish tried to call out to me when I swapped the earplug for a headphone, but I ignored him as I popped it in. I was listening to a 2-minute story about something or another, but as I scrolled to the next one, I was surprised to find it was a live stream from a familiar room. I could see myself sitting there, face glued to the phone, but as I watched, Raish looked straight at the camera and smiled. I was infuriated. Mr. Castleberry was just live streaming himself as he scared some dumb kid of the week. In fact, the title of the stream was High School Kid Tormented by Demon,
though demon was in air quotes. He had tricked me. Why would he do that?
Why, indeed?
Raish asked, staring at me through the camera as if he could see me through the phone.
What do you owe him? He made a fool of you online. What if your friends saw this? What would they think? You'd be a social outcast. Why not give them something to watch? I bet you'd love nothing more than to wrap your hands around this fool's throat and choke the life out of him. Do it. No one would know. Just walk over here and...
I was getting up, but as I took a step towards the bed, alarm bells rang in my head. Raish was messing with me. Looking back down at my phone, I could see it was just a generic TikTok shop stream. And when I looked back up, Raish was so close that his nose was pressed against the barrier.
Come on, just one more step, and you can do whatever you want to him. Kill him, kiss him, do his laundry. I don't care. Just let me out, he bellowed,
and I stumbled back into my chair as he laughed. After that, I just watched TikTok with the subtitles on. I didn't trust my ears anymore. I made it till 2, but after that, my yawns started to sneak up on me. I wished I'd brought an energy drink or something. I wasn't used to staying up this late, not regularly, and my eyes were getting heavy. I swapped over to an adventure game on my phone, but it kept slipping longer and longer the later I got. I could see Raish watching me, cat-like, as if just waiting for me to nod off. He was tricky, and I wondered if Mr. Castleberry had any coffee in his kitchen. I just had to make it a little longer, just a few more hours, and I was home free. I made it till 3:10 before I lost the fight. One moment I was running my 8-bit knight through my 100th dungeon, and the next I heard someone giggling from the bed. I looked up to find not the leering Raish, but Stephanie Morgan from my math class. She was joined by Tina Feller, Debbie Ross, and half of the cheerleading squad, whose names I was a little foggy on. They were in their underwear and seemed to be beckoning me to come join them. There were comments about long division and making a human pyramid, and as I got slowly to my feet, something seemed off. Where was Raish? He'd been there a minute ago. He might not have been present, but something in their voices as they called me to the bed reminded me of him. It was underneath their voice, something wicked and hidden, and I shook my head and snapped my eyes open not a moment too soon. I was standing at the edge of the circle again. I'd lost 20 minutes, and Raish was cursing like a sailor as he had a tantrum in the middle of the large bed. He was thrashing hard enough to jounce the frame, but not hard enough to disturb the salt. He looked at me with real scorn on his face, clearly contemplating all the terrible things he wanted to do to me.
You were so close! The booby trap always gets them!
I was wide awake now, but I knew it wouldn't last long unless I found something to focus on. 3 hours. I had 3 hours. Despite the knowledge, I smiled at the old imp. Can't trick me, Raish. No deceitful person will dwell in my house. No liar will stand in my presence. To my surprise, Raish sat back like I'd slapped him. I blinked. That was different. What? Not a big fan of scripture? Raish looked at me sardonically.
Obviously. I would prefer if you keep it to yourself in the future.
Message received, I thought. Maybe there was more to God than I had thought. So that was how I spent the last 3 hours of my night. I kept the old worn Bible on my lap, and whenever Raish would start trying to worm his way back in, I would begin to read from it. It put him off talking, right up until the sky began to lighten. Then he turned to me, my eyes barely staying open, and delivered one final bit of crypticness.
I don't have much time. When you think back on this night, I want you to remember that you could have had more than this old stick ever. He growled out. As the first rays of light came up over the windowsill, he twisted violently, so violently that I thought he had broken his neck. He twitched a few more times, screaming hoarsely until he finally settled back into bed. I sighed in relief as he twitched again, realizing it was over as I packed the cross and the Bible back into the box, with the gun and the earplugs and the spray bottle. The spray bottle went in last, and as I secured the lid, Mr. Castleberry sat up and stretched grandly. He blinked and looked at me, smiling as he realized I was still there. I had a feeling you would be less easy to scare off. As promised, you'll pass with an A now. Here, he said, and to my surprise, he fished $200 bills out of his nightstand. What's this for? I give anyone who works the sundown shift $200 when they're done. There's more where that came from, if you'd like to come back. The number of people who come back, believe it or not, is surprisingly low. I asked him how he could afford this, and he smiled, laughing warmly. I don't teach for the money. I teach because it's what I love to do. My father set me up before I was born, something I don't think Raish knows. Money doesn't mean the same thing to demons that it does to us, and I think he just sees it as a thing I have. I don't covet it, so he doesn't see it as a vice. $200, I thought, for 12 hours of basically nothing. I could sit 3 nights with Mr. Castleberry and make what I make at the fast food place in a week. I'd have to think about this pretty hard, but I was definitely tempted to come back. I knew what I was in for now, so it would be easier a second time. I knew Raish would probably have more tricks, but maybe I'd be ready, now that I was prepared. Before I left that day, I asked him what the demon had given him to get such control after dark. Mr. Castleberry thought about it for a moment and finally decided to share the secret with me. My mother was sick, very sick, and I was looking for a miracle to make her better. Raishael came to me and offered me a deal. He would possess my body after dark, control me from sun up to sun down, and in exchange, my mother would be spared from the disease that was killing her. I agreed on the condition that he couldn't do anything that would take away my ability to be free during the day. He agreed, but it was all for nothing. What do you mean? I asked. Your mother lived, right? For a while. He didn't lie. He cured her of the cancer that was eating away at her. The cancer, however, had damaged her kidneys. She lived another 8 months before she died of renal failure. Let that be a lesson to you, should you decide to come back. Demons always promise the moon, but they don't tell you that the cheese is rotten. I left that room $200 richer, and maybe a little wiser, too. Wiser or not, it wasn't the last time I sat with Mr. Castleberry, or Raishael. I looked at the ad, unsure if my fever-addled brain was reading it right. Wanted, someone to infect me with the COVID-19 virus. Must be verified as sick, have paperwork verifying illness no older than 2 days from today's date, and be willing to allow me to spend time near them. Will pay $500 for 8 hours in your company. Contraction of virus notwithstanding. Please email me immediately, with an email address attached. I had only been infected by the virus for the last 3 days, but I had been affected by it for the last 2 months. I had been laid off from work after a drop in profits had caused the store to go into bankruptcy. My boss had been very apologetic, but he still hadn't been able to keep the doors open. We had all hit the unemployment line after that, but unemployment wasn't as good as overtime. I'll admit, I had been living a little outside my means, and the bills were starting to pile up. Getting sick had ended my job search, and $500 was going to go a long way to settling my debt and keeping the lights on.
And all that for letting a stranger hang out in my house for 8 hours sounded like a dream come true. I contacted him, and he offered to come over that very night, cash in hand. We discussed hours. I'm a dedicated night owl, and he agreed to come over at about 6 p.m. His knock dragged me out of my stupor at around 5:45, and I staggered up to get the door. I didn't expect to be greeted by a well-dressed man in his mid-30s. I'd expected a weirdo, maybe some disease fetishist who got off on being sick, but this guy was surprisingly well put together. He wore black slacks, a button-down shirt, no mask, and his brown hair was close-cropped with a square pair of little gold glasses that made him look like a banker. He shook my hand, something no one had done in a while, and took an envelope of money out of his pocket. He showed me 5 crisp $100 bills, and then I led him into the living room. He sat in my armchair, leaning in close as I sagged back onto the couch and stared at me intently. "So, what do we do now?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just whatever you usually do. Watch TV, play video games, whatever. Hopefully my proximity will be all it takes to get the disease, and I'll achieve my goal." "I had wondered about that," I said, sneezing into a Kleenex and wincing as he leaned in closer. "This disease is supposed to be pretty bad. Why exactly do you want it?" "I'd tell you, but honestly, it would sound crazy," he said with a chuckle. I shrugged. "It's not like we got anything else to do but watch Netflix for 8 hours. Tell me, it'll make the time pass." He glanced over at my bookshelf, eyes roaming as though he was looking for something particular, before settling on and taking a paperback from the middle. It was a newer book, Fields of the Foregone, and he nodded as he inspected the spine. He must have liked what he saw because he smiled and held the book out to me. "I see you're a fan of my work. I'll sign it for you if you want, but my books are part of the reason I'm here." I squinted at him. Are you Timothy Corvin? The guy who writes the Ghostgrass series?" He nodded. "Yep, 3-time New York Times bestseller." I gaped at him for a few seconds before asking my next question. "Why the hell are you at my apartment trying to get sick?" He smiled, but the smile was sad. "You could say that the writing is why I'm here." He sat down again and made himself comfortable before telling me the strangest story I'd ever heard. "I got sick about a month ago. It came on quickly, cough, fever, typical flu-like symptoms, but I assured my agent that it wouldn't be an issue. I'd finish my latest novel and have it on her desk by the end of the month. First couple of days weren't so bad. I was still lucid, and I managed to get some work done. I was trucking right along, making good progress, when the real sickness hit. Suddenly I was feverish, scatterbrained, and I could hardly focus long enough to get off the couch. I spent my days in a stupor, high on cold medicine and barely coherent. My nights consisted of rolling around in a fever-fueled daze that made me question whether I was dreaming or awake. I had these dreams, you see. I say dreams because I can't remember them, but I couldn't do anything but remember them then. I would sit on the couch and mumble about them all day, reeling through their world as I tried to wrap my head around them. I raised an eyebrow at him. "It sounds pretty bad. Sounds like you didn't get a lot done." "Oh, quite the contrary. The longer I raved about the stories, the more I started to write about them. Not so much writing, I guess. I read through my notes the other day, and it was more like drunken ramblings. At some point, I moved on to chronicling them. I would come to at my computer, banging away at a story, not sure what I was doing or how long I'd been doing it. The stories were great, but they were so far outside of what I normally did that I couldn't wrap my incoherent brain around them. As the fever started getting worse, I would slip into these fugue states and just write for hours on end. One day I came out of one and found I had an email from my agent. I had sent her a draft for one of the stories. I was so worried. These stories were really weird, completely batty, and I was afraid that she would drop me as a client if she read what my fever-swallowed brain had cooked up. He took a sip from his coffee then, wetting his pipes, and my own fever-addled brain became a little impatient. "So, what did she think?" "Oh, she loved it. She said it was the most unique thing she had ever read, the most unique thing she had read in ages, and wanted to know when I was going to be done with it. Reading through what I had sent her and the stuff I was working on before I got better, I can see what she was talking about. It is both similar to so many things and completely different. It's a timeless story that sits completely outside of the normal processes. It seems to contain 2 antagonists and no hero. A war with nothing but loss and stakes that don't seem to make any sense. It was almost Lovecraftian, and I found myself as interested in hearing how it turned out as she was. But that was where the problem arose. He looked at my glass of water longingly, and I slid it across the table to him. If he wanted to get sick, then more power to him. He was paying after all, so he might as well get his money's worth. He reached out and brought it to his lips, throat working as he swallowed. I tried not to gag. There was probably backwash in that. My meds were squashing the fever that was keeping my brain in its altered state of mind. I was always careful never to ride it for too long, but the high was more than a little intoxicating. I would time travel in those moments, starting on my couch and coming to at my computer as I finished more pages than I'd ever done. I throttled back on my meds a little, wanting to stretch this out for as long as I could, but eventually my body started to get better. My fugue states became fewer and fewer. I found that I couldn't tap into that hidden world, and the story wasn't something that I could just make up as I went along. It was unknown, unheard of, and my mind couldn't begin to tap into that place by itself. My agent was wild to have more, wanting an ending, wanting a sequel, and that's when I started thinking about contracting it again. I lifted an eyebrow at him. I know that's what brought you here, that's what you told me on the phone, but I still have a hard time believing that you want this crap. It's miserable. Between the headaches and the near constant fever, I seem to mostly exist in a state of misery. Some people are experiencing it even worse than I have. What if you get the kind that's really bad and you're hospitalized? It seems like that would put a damper on your writing. He shrugged. That's the thing. Even when I'm experiencing the same symptoms as you, I still get the urge to write. I don't know if it's subconscious or what, but my brain takes over and forces my body to keep writing. Maybe it's not even my conscious mind. Maybe it's this place, and I've been tapped when I'm in these fugue states. I've had this thing 3 times now, you know. If I had had water in my hand, I would have probably did a spit take. 3 times? My God, you rarely hear of anybody getting it more than twice. After I got better the first time, I was struggling to keep up, he said, suddenly looking far away. I tried faking it, but it just wasn't the same. My agent started to notice. She started to send my stuff back with notes like, I need more of the voice you had in the first draft. I started getting desperate. She told me that she shared my notes with some of her colleagues, and they were very excited about how it was all coming together. So I started putting the pieces together and decided that I needed to recreate the situation. You needed to get sick again, I said. He nodded. I needed to get sick again. I started slowly, waiting in hospitals and waiting rooms, looking for sick people, but I became desperate after a while. I got lucky the first time, a chance encounter with a sick friend. One trip to their apartment, and I was back where I started, feverish and coughing on my couch as I waited for the time skips to start. Did they? Would I still be running the ad if they hadn't? This time, though, something was different. This time I was treated to some of the most vivid dreams I've ever had. I wasn't just hearing about my 2 antagonists. I could see them. I watched them play their shadow games, maneuver their pieces, snatch territory only to lose it again. All the while I was chronicling them. It became a mania for me. I refused to take anything to dull the fever this time, but it didn't seem to matter. After a week, my fever was abating, and I was back to trying to fake it. But I couldn't fake it. I wouldn't even try. I needed the dreams. I needed the visions. I needed the writing fits that I never remembered. That was when I started running the ads. The lady at the paper didn't want to run them at first. She said I was sick, but once I offered to pay her triple the going rate, she caved. As I watched him talk about it, I reflected that he did look pretty sick. Not physically, but mentally, I mean. He looked like an addict describing his favorite drug. As he talked, he scratched at his arm, his face taking on a smiling rictus as he described the visions. I began to wonder just how this disease, or maybe it was the story that had affected him. I wanted to tell him to leave off for his own good, but I really did need the money. I've sunk nearly $5,000 into getting this disease. Did I tell you that? Every time I post the ad, someone responds. After so many, though, my body has built up antibodies to it, and every time I get it, it's a little less effective. The last time I contracted it, I barely had it for a week. I was so anxious to get any work out of it that I don't think I got more than 30 pages the whole week. 30 pages? I gasped. I was no writer, but that seemed like a prolific amount of work for a sick person. I know, what a disgrace. The first time I was nearly averaging 30 pages a day, but after the first time I never managed it again. You were getting that much a day? His eyes glazed a little. He didn't seem pleased with what he saw, and he looked at my popcorn ceiling. I see them constantly. I simply can't make sense of it on my own. I can't convey something like storms battling for supremacy, tectonic plates crashing against each other as they try to change the land. Their fugues allow me to tap into something primal that could understand these ideas. My puny lizard brain just can't make anything out of it. You know, reading these things I've written, understanding only enough of what I've written, scares me a little. How much of your book have you written? I asked, not sure I wanted an answer. He scratched again, still uncomfortable, but wanting to discuss his drug of choice nonetheless. I've written 5 books. I've cataloged the lives of these two from the moment of their birth to the very last encounter they had directly. I gaped at him. He was talking about 5 books in what must have been a matter of months. I couldn't even consider something like that, and I began to wonder how large they were. The pages, the volume he was talking about per day surely meant that these were no small books. He didn't seem to understand where these stories were coming from either, which made them all the more mysterious and unknown. Can you tell me about them? He gave me a dead-eyed look, and I almost regretted asking. It's not something people really want to know in the end. This little experiment started as a way to write the next great fantasy series, but my agent stopped returning my emails about 3 weeks ago. The last 2 endeavors have been solely so I could learn how it ends, how we end. We? Humanity. We are the ultimate prize that these 2 creatures fight over. More specifically, they fight over the right to subjugate and entertain themselves with us. We see their battles as normal. We see their battles as nothing but the changing of the seasons, but they see them as nothing short of war. I can tell you, but you won't want to know once I'm done. I didn't really want to know anymore, but I felt like I had to know. In the end, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. He spent the next 10 hours telling me about the battle between the Green Man and the Pale Lady. He told me of their beginnings in Strange, their emergence, and their eventual exile, and how they came to be on this plane of existence in the first place. He told me about the Brandylow, the servants of the Pale Lady, and the numerous agents of the Green Man. He told me how this green warrior was worshipped as a pagan deity, how he took his sacrifices, and how he sought out those who ran. It's funny how 10 hours can seem like a half hour when someone is telling you about the eldritch deities that you never knew you wanted to know about. When the alarm on my phone went off, reminding me to take my meds, I realized that it was 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. Timothy got up, checking his own phone, and seemed to realize that he'd been talking all night. Seems I've gone over my time a little. Here, as promised, he said, taking out the money and handing it to me as he left. Wait, I said, dropping the envelope and coming shakily from the couch. How does it end? He looked back and shrugged. Hopefully I'll find out. If I do, I'll let you know. Then he left, and I wouldn't hear from him for another 3 months. Well, I'd never hear from him again, but he would make good on his promise. I felt better by the end of the week, my fever breaking and my headache getting better and better. I finally acquired a negative test and started looking for work again. I got lucky. The bar up the road was hiring, and they needed someone to start right away. They had only recently been allowed to reopen, and the bartender was working double duty as the barback to help out. Before I knew it, I was bussing tables and hauling kegs like an old pro. I enjoyed the work, though it wasn't something I'd ever done before, and it felt nice to get back to work after a long absence. Then, one afternoon, I was helping my boss open, flipping on the TV and preparing to tune in to one of the sports channels like I often did. That's when I saw the little squib on the news that made me stop. The city is mourning the death of local writer Timothy Corvin, who died of COVID-related symptoms in St. Graham's this morning. Mr. Corvin, the writer of the Ghostgrass series, is survived by his father and his older sister. Service will be held Tuesday for his friends and family at... I couldn't believe it. The guy had been in my house not even a month ago. Had I killed him? Had he contracted his fatal disease from me? I had to sit down. I didn't know what to make of it. My boss must have noticed that something was off because he tried to send me home, wondering if I still had some latent symptoms of being sick. I told him I was fine, though, and I went back to work. As I worked, I wondered if he'd discovered the end he was looking for. I got my answer in the mail a couple of months later. A package was waiting on the stoop. I hadn't ordered anything, and the return address was from Samantha Drummond. The delivery address was mine, though, so I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a manuscript, bound in twine with no title across the surface. On the top of the journal was a typed note from Mrs. Drummond informing me of her package's purpose. "Hello, my brother requested that I send this to you after he passed. He was very adamant that it be placed in your care. All the best, Mrs. Drummond." I lifted out the journal, opening the front page and bearing a message written in a shaky hand. "I found the end. Let's hope it helps you after I'm gone. I've been sitting here looking at the book for close to an hour, not sure whether I should read it or just burn it. If the beings Timothy had talked about had been using his infected body as a mouthpiece, I'm not sure I want to open my mind to them. This book contains their history, contains their past, present, and future, and this knowledge was gained at the cost of a life. Will they come to infect me if I subject myself to this arcane wisdom? That knowledge scares me more than a little as I put the journal back in the box and carry it to my room. I decided to put it in the closet for now. Some things are better left unknown, I think." It was a fight like any of the others we had recently had. Little did I know, it would be the last fight we ever had, though. Our fight was about grades. They all seemed to be about grades at that time. He'd been heading out the door, dressed to go hang out in the woods with his little hoodlums he called friends. I suspected they were drinking, and I was absolutely sure they were out there smoking. I was tired of cleaning up after him and watching him slip slowly into delinquency. He told me he'd be back, and I told him to stop and come have a seat instead. He glowered at me from the door, knowing what I wanted to talk about, and not liking it. He slammed the door and came to sit on the couch, knowing he was about to sit down for another ass chewing. His grades had come in, and they were the worst they had ever been. When I told him this, he said it wasn't his fault. I sighed. It was never his fault. Nothing was ever his fault. There was always someone else to blame, someone else to point the finger at, and it was never up to him to take responsibility. This was old ground. We retread it for the 1,000th time, it seemed. He would have to repeat the 11th grade at this rate. He said he didn't care. He would have to quit his job if he couldn't keep his grades up. He didn't care about that either. I would snatch everything but his heir. His car, his games, his computer, everything that mattered to him, and he would be stuck with nothing but studying. And that was the stroke that finally got through to him. Mom never had to stoop to this. Mom always knew there was a better way than to just punish me all the time. He said exactly what he knew I needed to hear to lose my temper. "Well, she isn't here, is she, Marcus? She's dead. Or have you forgotten?" I could see by his pained expression that I'd touched a nerve. How could either of us forget that little fact? It just hadn't felt like home here without her. We had done a lot of fighting, staying cooped up in our rooms, and not a lot of talking about the hurt we both felt at her passing. She had always kept us from escalating to this level of arguments that would quickly come to the cusp of violence, I was starting to believe. My wife had been the pillar that held our relationship up. My wife had been dead for almost a year now, and it had been the worst year of my life. She died very suddenly, painlessly, the EMTs told me. She had been turning into the grocery store to get our weekly shopping list done when a bus had struck her car. Her car had rolled 4 times before coming to rest against a tree, and the impact had killed her even as it smashed in the doors of the car. I can remember when I'd gotten the phone call, sitting at my desk and preparing to file some reports. I had given bad news to spouses like this 1,000 times when I was on the force, but it's different when that kind of horror visits you personally. We buried her in the family plot, and the two of us had gone home to try and make the most of the house we had left. We had fought bitterly nearly every day since. I saw Marcus tear up and turn away before he could see my eyes filling up as well. "I hate you. Sometimes I wish I'd been in that car with her." That took me back a moment, and I answered out of anger before I could stop myself. "Sometimes, son, I wish you had too." We were silent for a solid minute before he got up and walked slowly towards the hallway. "Then don't bother worrying about me anymore. Maybe I'll go talk to Mom, see if she wants to listen." Then he stomped down the hallway and slammed his door behind himself, leaving me alone to feel like a shitty parent and the worst person alive. I spent the next few hours bustling about to distract myself. I made dinner, folded some laundry, and generally picked up while dinner boiled and simmered. When it finally finished, I assembled it on a plate and took it to the door of his room, intending it to be a peace offering. "Marcus," I called his name softly, knocking on the door and leaning in to listen. The other side of the door was quiet, not a sound to be heard, but I thought I could hear the creak of the mattress as its occupant rolled over. I sighed. He was ignoring me. That made me angry. I was trying to extend an olive branch, and here he was ignoring me. "Well, dinner's in the fridge when you decide to stop being mad," I said. His dinner went into the fridge, and I decided to flip on my Xbox and try to block out his childish behavior. I was still playing later when I heard the door creak open and the light footsteps he always used when he was trying to sneak out of his room. I ignored him as he scuttled up the hallway, clearly checking to see if I was in the living room. It had gotten dark a few hours ago. A check of the time showed me it was 10 o'clock, and I was a little angry that he was still awake. As he crossed behind the couch, I told him to get his food and go to bed. "You don't need to stay up all night." He didn't say anything. He just scuttled off to his room and closed the door. I went back to playing my game, and about an hour later I took myself off to bed. I locked my door, just in case, but I wasn't expecting any trouble. My son was a hothead, just like his old man, but he wasn't usually violent. He was a good kid, but it was hard to see the good under all that yelling. I wish now that I had looked harder. Maybe I could have prevented what came next. The next day was Saturday, and I spent the day cleaning and catching up on things. I didn't see my son all day. He didn't come out for meals or just to ask me if he could have any of the myriad of things returned for the weekend. This wasn't out of the ordinary for him. Last summer, he would just stay up all night, and we'd never see him until morning, or the few times he got a wild hair to wake up early. After last night, I was a little glad he didn't come out. Truth be told, I didn't really want to see him, and his silence was kind of nice. When noon rolled around and I hadn't heard the flush of a toilet or the footsteps across the floor, I became a little concerned. I went to his door and knocked, calling his name, expecting to hear some response. There was nothing, not a sound from inside, and I started to feel angry again. I remembered how he had iced me out the night before, and left without saying anything. If he wanted to play the silent treatment game, so could I. I didn't think about it again until I was getting ready for bed, his door still not having rattled all day. I showered, took my sleep aid, and went to bed. Getting comfy down under the covers, I started to think that maybe I should be more concerned. Was he sick? Hurt? Perhaps he was waiting for me to apologize so he could get back on even footing. I got half out of bed before my anger flared up again. He just wanted me to be the first one to crack. I rolled back in bed, putting the pillow over my head as I tried to fall asleep. I wasn't going to play these games with him. I was not going to be the first one to crack. I awoke in the middle of the night to a loud crashing noise in the kitchen. I was next to the bed in a heartbeat, police training taking over, finding the box that held my handgun. I crept towards the bedroom door, quiet as a mouse, as the destruction continued to cascade around the kitchen. I wrapped my hand around the doorknob, just as a sound like a stove tipping over crunched across the house. I winced, wondering who the hell was making such a ruckus in my kitchen. It had to be some meth head or something. No burglar would be this incompetent. I opened the door quietly and tiptoed through the living room, boxer shorts being my only covering. The noise had stopped after the loud crash, but I was taking no chances. The last thing I wanted to do was get jumped on as I came around the corner, and I kept my gun up and at the ready. When I peeked around the edge of the bar, I could see a huge mess spreading across the usually pristine kitchen. The refrigerator doors were open, food and juice spilling everywhere, and the stove was indeed flipped onto its face as it lay on the floor. Bakelite glass was scattered across the ground and added to the overall catastrophe that had stretched across the kitchen. Of my intruder, however, there was no sign. I searched across the house and found no one. The door was locked, front and back, and none of the windows were open. It was pretty clear that no one had broken in to trash my kitchen, and I could feel my anger flare up again as I looked at the disaster. Only one person could have been responsible for this, and he was currently pretending I didn't exist. This time I hammered on the door. "What the hell? You ruined my kitchen, wasted my food, and just scuttle back off to your hole? Get your ass out here and help me clean this shit up." No sound came from inside. I was furious. Did he think he could just wreck the house and then ignore me? Who the hell did he think he was? He was on thin ice, and if this was how he wanted to act, I would be suggesting to his grandmother tomorrow that maybe he ought to go live with her for a while. He was 17 after all, and if he wanted to act like an idiot, I was tempted to call the police. Let him spend a night in jail if that's how he wanted to act. I threw the door open then, and there he was, lying with his back to me under his heavy comforter. "Get your ass up. You can help me clean up this mess, and then we can have a long talk about why you think it's okay to destroy my kitchen." He lay still, ignoring me, giving me the literal cold shoulder. I took a step into his room, fists balled up as I prepared to turn him over roughly and shout at him until he decided to listen. I stopped myself, though, after that first step. Maybe this was what he wanted. If I had considered that the police might solve my problem for me, then surely he had as well. He was hoping I would get rough with him so he could get me in trouble. Well, I was not about to play right into his hands. I grabbed the chair from beside his door and wedged it up under the doorknob as I closed it behind myself. Good luck wrecking the place now, asshole. I didn't sleep that night. I cleaned the kitchen before dragging myself back to bed just as the sun came up. I was filthy, sweaty, and smelled strongly of pine sol. The kitchen had taken a lot of work, and I fell into a filthy, thin sleep as I lay in my bed. My dreams were full of wrecked kitchens, thankless children, and lots of screaming. I slept poorly despite my tiredness and woke up grumpy and sore. I saw that the chair was still there as I walked to the bathroom and sniffed. He probably could have opened that door, but it would have taken a lot of shoving. Likely his activities from the night before had taken a lot out of him, and now he was too tired to get up. Oh well, I thought. He'll get hungry sometime, and then he'll have to come out and talk to me. I showered, ate a late breakfast, and busied myself with the rest of the day. I kept listening for him, expecting him to curse as he discovered the chair I'd pushed under his door, or flush a toilet, but he never made a peep. His room was as quiet as a tomb, and he never so much as turned on the TV or walked to the bathroom. That should have raised a red flag with me, but I was still so mad from the night before. If he wanted to starve in there, let him do it, I suppose. I left him alone, and when it was time for bed, I crawled in gladly and was snoozing about the time my head hit the pillow. I heard the chair scrape harshly across the floor about 11, and I climbed out of bed to go catch him leaving his room as the sounds became harsher still. I got about halfway across the bedroom when something hit my door hard enough to rattle it in its frame. I took a step back, startled, waiting to see if he would knock it down or simply keep battering at it. After the sounds of breaking wood rattled across the room, I realized the something was the chair I had put under my son's door. After the chair shattered, he started battering the door with his fists, and I reached for the handgun on my nightstand even as I reached for the phone on my charger. I dialed 911 and laid the phone against my ear, pointing the gun at the door steadily. I didn't want to shoot my son, but if he came in meaning to harm me, I would do what I had to do. The operator picked up on the second ring. 911, what is your emergency? I told them that I needed some officers to come to my address. I told them that my son was acting violently, possibly under the influence, and I desperately needed help. The operator could hear the sounds of someone trying to batter my door in, and said that she would dispatch help right away. She told me to stay on the line, and I did just that. My aim shook a little as something put a fist-sized hole in my door. The frame shook and the surface bulged, as whatever was trying to break in tore through the first layer of the door and into the interior. I haven't prayed since my wife died, but I prayed then that whatever God resided over all wouldn't make me shoot this child I had raised. I saw something crawl through the hole in the blackness of the dark room and reach for the doorknob. I leveled my gun and prepared to fire if the door opened. It slid around the knob, and I heard it twist just before the lock caught. Thankfully, I had remembered to lock the door. It had fumbled at the simple turn lock when the first blue and whites flashed through the windows. The black thing retreated then, and the silence that followed it was almost deafening. I snuck across the room to the door, gun leading as I peeked out into the hallway. The shadowy hall was empty, the door to the living room closed, and I shoved the door open noisily as it hung broken on the hinges. The police were banging on the door, calling to see if someone would let them in. I put the gun on the bookshelf by my door, not wanting to get shot myself, and I called to them to tell them that I was the caller and I was opening the door. The door came open, and they had their hands on their holsters, waiting to see who would open the door. They took in my boxer shorts and my scared face and asked me what had happened. I told them everything. I told them about the fight I'd had with my son. I told them about how he'd been in his room for days on end, only coming out at night to eat or cause trouble. I told them about the mess in the kitchen, even showing them some pictures I'd taken on my phone. I told them about the silent treatment we'd been engaged in for the last few days, and how tonight had simply been the icing on the cake. They agreed to come with me to talk to him. I knocked on the door, already knowing what I'd find. There was no response. The cops looked at me skeptically, but I told them this was just how he'd been lately. I opened the door to find him turned away from the door, blankets pulled up over himself, the same way he had been the last time I tried to talk to him. "Marcus, you need to stop playing games and talk to these men. You went too far. My door is destroyed. You need to get up and tell them what you did." Marcus said nothing. That's when my temper flared again, and I strode forward to yank the blankets off the bed. "Get the hell up! Stop being such a child! I know you can—" When the blankets came off, I saw the dried blood soaked into the mattress. It had pooled on the floor beside the bed, and Marcus lay on his side as his eyes stared sightlessly at the wall. His body had begun to bloat, the skin blackening, and his wrists were jagged rips up his arm. The knife he had used was still clutched in his hand, and the blade was dark with dried blood. I spent several hours in the police station, shaking and trying to come to terms with what had happened. The cops hadn't put me in handcuffs. Professional courtesy, I guess. But they had implied that they suspected this wasn't as cut and dry as it looked. I suspected that they thought I had attempted to cover up a murder, but when the coroner's report came back, they determined that he'd been dead for a few days. The going consensus was he had killed himself after our last fight. They found a note on his desk, and if they hadn't already thought I was a shitty parent, that certainly sealed it. Not only had I essentially let my son kill himself and ignored him for the next 2 days, but I had driven him to it as well. The note he'd left said, "If you wish I had died in that crash so much, then let me just give you what you want. I'll be sure to tell Mom why I'm here so soon." They cut me loose an hour ago, but all I can do is sit in my car and shake. Part of it's grief. I can't believe I have to go back to that empty house by myself. I can't believe we'll never be able to put all this behind us and move on. I can't believe I'll never get to see him grow up, have kids of his own. I've lost everything now. My son, my wife, everything that made my house a home. But I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't fear as well. Because if my son was dead, what was the thing that destroyed my kitchen and came after me tonight? It passed within a few inches of me on that first night, and thinking back on that makes me shiver. The cops ignored me when I asked what I was supposed to do about whatever attacked me tonight. I know they think I'm making it up, trying to garner some kind of sympathy for my negligence, but I know what I saw. I saw that long, shadowy arm creep into the hole in my door. If it wasn't my son, then what the hell was that? As I sit in my car writing this, I don't know if I'll ever go home again. I don't even know if I have a home anymore. I grew up outside of Copenhagen. Most of my life spent on my father's sheep farm. It's a beautiful country if you've never been, and I can think of no better place to spend my childhood. The rolling hills and forests are perfect for playing knights or policemen or whatever a child may want. The trees became my castles, the underbridges, my banks, or shops to chase robbers from, and I spent the hours outside of my chores letting my imagination run wild. That imagination was probably why no one believed me when I told them about the ravens. I'd been telling tales since I was very young. I claimed I'd seen fairies dancing around a mushroom ring. I'd seen a parade of lights that had turned out to be the procession of Queen Mab, that I had seen dinosaurs in the forest, and black dogs, and kelpies, and all sorts of things. I loved stories, so I wanted to see something magical. The world was often such a dour place that I prayed for a little magic in my life, and created it until I could find my wish fulfilled. I was 9 when I found some of that magic, but I wasn't quite as ready as I believed I was. My grandparents lived less than a mile from our farm. Their property was at the back end of ours, truth be told, and when my gran called and said she had just baked a bunch of cookies and was hoping I could come help her eat some of the extras, I turned hopefully to my mum and asked if I could go over for some cookies. Mum asked if my chores were done, and I said they were. It was summer. I wouldn't have to go fill the sheep feeders till after dinner. I'd been diligent through the day, and now my midday was mine to do what I liked. "You may," Mum said, "but put on your slicker and your wellies. It looks like rain." A few minutes later, I was set out in my duck-yellow slicker with my big green rubber gum boots on an adventure to Grandma's house. I found a stick on the way, my sword for this quest, and I was cutting through the sheep fields and heading for the little path between the fields. It was a place I liked to play sometimes, and my grandfather had told me it had once been the site of a great battle. He said old Danish kings were known to make war on each other, and the land around Copenhagen had seen a lot of bloodshed over the years. The area between the farms, but a quarter-mile of dirt road, was said to have been the site of several skirmishes, and I wonder now how many had lost their lives there. As a child, however, it was just fun to think of knights fighting each other as their steel clanged and the horses whinnied. I heard the thunder rumble, something that was not the loud sound of hooves charging forward, and thought that Mum was right. The rain would be coming soon. If I didn't want to get wet, I needed to hurry. Getting wet wasn't really something I was too worried about, but Gran liked to keep the house nice and dry, and a wet little boy was likely to be asked to leave after he'd eaten only a few cookies. I came out onto the road, racing the rain, but I wasn't alone. Perched on the wooden fence which separated the road from the fields were ravens. I don't mean crows or blackbirds. I mean ravens. If you've never seen them together, then you might not understand, but ravens are quite a bit larger than crows. They are more than a little scary looking too, especially to a child not yet 10. I expected they would take flight when I came onto the road, but they did not. They sat looking at me like hateful old men watching a trespasser, and it was clear that they would not leave simply because I was there. They were proud birds, and this was their place, and it was I who was the interloper. It was spooky, but I wasn't really afraid of them. I was a little scared. There were a lot of them, and I was a small boy, but I didn't think they would hurt me. These were no boogeymen, no trolls or goblins, and they were more spooky than scary. Papa put out straw men to keep these devils out of the garden. They were birds, and birds couldn't hurt me. "Boy,"
said a voice, and I froze in my tracks. "Boy!" it said again, and I looked around to see who had spoken. Was it one of the ravens? Ravens could speak. I'd heard that somewhere, and maybe these ravens had picked up a word or two. Mum said ravens were smart after all, so it wasn't that hard to imagine that it could be them talking. I kept walking, trying not to look at them as I went. They were just birds. They didn't want anything from me. Birds didn't talk to people. They just, "Boy, stop!" the same croaky voice said. That drew me up short. The bird had told me to stop, so I had. I felt a chill run up my spine as I turned to look at the group of crows. A murder. It was a murder when it was crows. And I saw one that was different. His feathers were white. They weren't gray. They were snow white. His beak and legs were black, the color his feathers ought to be, but his eyes were the most frightening part of him. They were red, like a rat's eyes, and they stared at me with far too much intelligence. We just stood there for a while, staring at each other as the thunder built overhead, and I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. It was still just a bird, so it had two words. What of it? Didn't mean it was different from the rest or anything. "Thank you, boy," it said, its speech perfectly understandable, if not a little raspy. "I was not sure you would stop for a moment. I have to ask a favor of you, but in return I will grant you any wish you desire." I looked around, expecting to see someone standing nearby throwing their voice, but it was just me and the ravens. The thunder rumbled again overhead, but the rain, coming on fast behind me, was the least of my concerns. Now I was more worried about the talking raven with the white feathers. I started to say, not sure how to answer. "Are you talking to me?" The raven appeared to chuckle, a clicking sound that the others picked up quickly. "Well, who else would I be talking to? You and I are the only ones talking out here, are we not?" I nodded, supposing that was so. "So I am here to offer you your heart's desire in exchange for a favor of my asking. Do you agree?" I started to nod. I was very close to just nodding before learning more, but Papa had always been very clear about blindly accepting things. Papa was a man who had worked to get where he was, and he always told me to be wary of deals that seemed too good to be true. Anyone who wants you to sign on the dotted line without letting you read the contract is trying to trick you out of something, and it's often something you wouldn't want to try to live without, he would say, and I remembered his words in the nick of time. "How is it that you can talk?" I asked, and the bird ruffled a little at the question. "Well, ravens are smart, everyone knows this, but I am a Valraven, and I am smarter than any of my brethren. Do you know why?" I did know why, as it happened. Grandfather had told me about the Valravens, just as he had told me about the trolls and the gnomes and the other magical creatures that inhabit our old world. "Valravens are ravens that have eaten the flesh of a king," I said, and the bird seemed to smile as much as a beak could smile. "Very close, boy. Valravens have eaten the heart of a king. It was right here, actually, a very long time ago. Would you like to hear about it?" I nodded. "Very much. My grandfather told me this place had seen many battles." "Your grandfather is wise," the white bird said. I was barely in my first year when I saw the pinions and banners waving. We were more interested in the men carrying them, however, my murder and I. In those days, when men with banners went somewhere, they were often bodies in the place where they stopped to do battle. Banners we were following that day. They did not do well, and we fell on them after the fighting was done and ate our fill. I found him then, the man with the shiny hat. I did not know he was a king, not then. I only knew that his hat had caught the light when the sun came out from behind a cloud, and it drew me to him. His armor was broken, and his blood was running free. Someone had pierced his heart with a lance, and I ate it happily. It was meat, and meat was good. But as I ate, I began to know things. I knew that the meat was a heart, and the hat was a crown, and the king was named Lenthal. His castle was far from here, in a place called Wales, and he would never go home again. Never again. I also knew something else. I knew I would never die until I gained what I needed. I would never truly live. That is why I need you, boy. You have what I need, and to get it, I am willing to make a deal with you. Whatever you desire shall be yours, but only if you agree to give me what I need.
For the second time that day, I was prepared to agree. My family was not rich, though we were better than most, and there were things I needed, just like any child. A new bike, a box kite, a real sword, a horse, a stable of horses. I could have anything I wanted. The Valraven was magic. Grandfather had said so. But as I opened my mouth, I remembered something else Grandfather had told me. The Valraven is a smart but tricksy bird. It knows it can only be human if it gains what it most desires, he had said, puffing his pipe as he sat before the fire. And what does it most desire, Grandfather? I asked, scooting a little closer as I waited for him to tell. I expected it to be treasure or a magic book or true love or something from the usual stories, but it was much worse than that. My grandfather leaned back and looked me in the eye as he delivered the answer, and I realized now that it had been intended to scare me. Grandfather believed in the things he talked about, trolls and redcaps and Valraven, and he wanted me to be wary of them as well. After that night, I certainly was wary, and it surprises me now that it took me so long to remember that night as I sat before the fire, listening to the tales. A child's heart, he almost whispered, and as I stood there in the road, I heard that same whisper creep up my spine like a spider in the dead of night.
Do we have a deal?
The Valraven asked, but I was already backing away. I shouldn't have talked to it. I shouldn't have stopped. And as I began to run, I heard the Valraven quark angrily as the murder took flight. I was running as fast as I could, the raindrops beginning to fall as my feet ate up the ground. I could see the lane that would take me to my grandparents' house, but it looked miles long as the beat of wings sounded behind me. There were so many of them, a whole murder of them,
and I fancied that my slicker rustled as they dove at me. The rain was falling hard now, the drops becoming a downpour, and I expected their talons to find me any minute. When the angry quark began to sound behind me, I looked back to see them flying drunkenly as the rain soaked them. Later I would find out that birds don't usually fly in the rain because it makes their feathers heavy, which makes their movements difficult and their steering and maintaining flight almost impossible. If they had come after me on a sunny day, I would have been ripped apart. Ravens are large, and in such numbers, I would have been unable to hold them off. Instead, the rain thwarted them, and I made it to my grandparents' house in one piece. Grandma was a little miffed at the mud and the water that I had tracked in, but I think she realized something was wrong when she found me curled up in a corner of her mudroom in tears. She asked me what had happened, clearly afraid that someone had tried to snatch me or some such thing, but I just kept shaking my head and whispering, "Valraven, Valraven," until she called my grandfather from the den and asked him what I was saying. Grandfather listened. He nodded, and then he took me in his arms and brought me into the den to sit by the fire. Grandmother came in a few minutes later with cookies and milk, and we sat and listened to the rain, Grandfather asking me if I'd seen one of the tricksy birds. I nodded, and he nodded in return. That was all that was ever said about it. After my cookies were eaten, he put me in his old truck and took me home. We never spoke of it again, and it was never brought up between anyone after that.
Did anyone else become a participant in the social experiment known as Flat Stanley? I went to elementary school in the mid-90s, 95 to 2001, and I was in the 3rd grade when our teacher announced that we would be taking part in the Flat Stanley project. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept, Flat Stanley was a series of books about a flat kid who goes on all kinds of weird adventures to famous places. New York, the Grand Canyon, France, Australia. This guy went everywhere and was like a flat version of Curious George. We started reading them in class, making them part of our English hour, and one day, Mrs. Gazel told us that we were going to have a contest. Today's English lesson is to create your own Flat Stanley. It can look however you want, but the winner of the contest will get 3 prizes from the prize basket, and will be the class's Flat Stanley that we send into the world to participate in the Flat Stanley project. We were all excited. This was a chance to see our work in pictures that would come back, not to mention get some cool stuff out of the prize basket. We all drew out our own concepts for Flat Stanley and set to work coloring and designing him. My Flat Stanley was a spy, wearing a big trench coat and a wide hat and carrying binoculars. He wore his regular clothes under it, and he just looked so goofy that I thought I had a real chance of winning. My friend Todd laughed when he glanced over at it, telling me it was cool. His Flat Stanley was a football player for the Georgia Bulldogs, his favorite team, and I thought his Flat Stanley looked cool too. So when the class voted on the displayed Stanleys, I figured Kaylee's Flat Stanley would win. It had a sparkly tiara and a ball gown she had made with felt. That was the one that I voted for, at least, since you couldn't vote for your own. And if not hers, I figured Matt's would win. His Flat Stanley was a truck driver, complete with a net hat and a sleeveless t-shirt, and he'd put a lot of work into it. I knew some kids might find mine funny, but I never figured I stood a chance. I hadn't used any special materials or done anything really innovative, and I figured I'd hang him in my room when I got home. So when Miss Gazel announced that my Flat Stanley had won, I was shocked. I went home that night with a new bounce ball, a pocket-sized Stretch Armstrong, and an eraser shaped like a Pikachu. I also went home to tell my mom that I had won the contest and that my Flat Stanley would be going out to other schools and other places, so we could get pictures back and see all the cool places that he had been. She said that sounded really neat, and we brainstormed where he might end up. Paris, Disneyland, the moon. We both laughed at that one, and maybe even at an Atlanta Braves baseball game. We had a good afternoon thinking about where he might end up, and when Dad got home, he joined us in our daydream. I went to bed that night, thinking about all the cool places Stanley might go, and what we might see when he came back. It started out pretty normal. Mrs. Gazel sent the package out to a school the next town over, and they sent us back pictures a week later. Stanley had been to a volleyball game, an art museum, and finally to a play put on by the class. They sent him up the road to the next school, where Stanley went on a hike, went to the zoo, and then went to a baseball game. It wasn't the Atlanta Braves, but it was a t-ball game, and that was still pretty neat. This went on for a couple of months, Flat Stanley traveling to Texas, New Mexico, California, Idaho, and Kansas. We hung the pictures up, sent out thank you cards, and talked about the places that Flat Stanley had gone. It was a good time, and we used it for our geography class to help us learn the states. It seemed that Flat Stanley was in all our lessons that year. Math: if Flat Stanley travels from Burbank, California to El Paso, Texas, how far has he traveled? Geography: if Flat Stanley is at the Alamo, then where is he? And of course, English, where we read the books and the letters that we got back out loud. It was approaching April when we came to class to find that Miss Gazel wasn't there. We were all pretty bummed because Wednesdays were usually when we got our Flat Stanley letters, and the sub told us that Miss Gazel would talk to us about it when she got back. There was no Flat Stanley that day, and when Miss Gazel came back the following week, we moved on to something else. All the Flat Stanley stuff had disappeared from the class, and its absence was as noticeable as our missing teacher had been. She never told us what had happened, and it was a mystery talked about in hushed tones well into the 4th grade. It would probably still be a mystery if I hadn't decided a decade later to pursue teaching. I'm in my 2nd year of college now, and I've progressed into student teaching. I decided that I wanted to try my hand at being an elementary school teacher, something like 4th or 5th grade, and when they gave me the name of my mentor, I realized I knew her. It was Miss Gazel, my old 3rd grade teacher. She taught 5th grade now, her retirement coming up on the horizon, and she smiled when she realized who I was, giving me a big hug. "Welcome back. I'm glad to see you decided to take up teaching." Her classroom was in the same room her 3rd grade class had been in, and the kids reminded me a lot of me and my friends when we were her students. They were a good group. They were hungry to learn, and they liked her a lot. Miss Gazel was the kind of teacher that kept kids' attention effortlessly, and I hoped it was a skill that I could learn from her. The kiddos in her class took to me pretty quickly, and soon I was teaching classes while Miss Gazel just sat back and observed. Something about being in her class again made me remember my days as a 3rd grader at this school, and that made me think about Flat Stanley. There was nothing like that in her 5th grade class. The kids would have probably thought it was babyish, but it did rekindle some of the mystery I had felt from a decade before. I tried to find a good time to bring it up, but nothing seemed to present itself. Until Friday, on my 2nd week. I was packing up to leave when Miss Gazel offered to take me out for some drinks. I was a little surprised, and she must have noticed because she laughed airily at my look of chagrin. "What, you didn't know teachers drank?" she said, her coat over one arm. I decided to join her and found a small group of other teachers waiting for us when we arrived. Some of them I knew, some of them I didn't, but it turned out that this was a regular thing for them. They drank and talked about their week, complained about some students who were especially difficult, and generally blew off steam. Mrs. Gazel and I sat in the corner, nodding and listening to them, and she smiled at me over the lip of her 4th glass of wine sometime near 11. "I've been sending glowing reviews to your professor," she confided. "You're one of the better student teachers I've ever worked with. I think you're probably a shoo-in to be hired at the end of your training period, and I'll recommend you to the principal myself, if he doesn't extend you a position." I thanked her, sipping my 2nd beer as I took it all in. "Hey, can I ask you something?" I said suddenly. "Neither of us are drunk enough for you to offer me a ride home yet, big fella," she said, snorting into her glass. No, nothing like that. Something always bugged me from my time in your class, and I was wondering if you remember the Flat Stanley project we did. Some of the color fled from her cheeks, and I could swear that she shuddered a little. I'm surprised you even remember that. It was a long time ago. Well, everything disappeared from the class so quickly, and when you came back, you never brought it up again. All the books were gone from the class library. All the letters were gone. Everything was missing. I think we talked about it for half of the 4th grade before something else caught our attention. She looked far away for a moment, as if contemplating whether she actually wanted to answer me or not. I think I need a little air. Would you care to escort me? I told her I would, and we left amidst a hail of catcalls about cradle robbers and cougars on the prowl. I'd taken her arm, and she was trying to be unbothered by it, but she was stiff and a little unsteady as we walked out onto the patio. Something had her spooked, and I didn't think it was the half-hearted teasing from her peers. When we came outside, she leaned against the railing outside the seating area, looking at the waves as they crashed against the water below us. I came to lean beside her, realizing she was trying to figure out how to begin, and having trouble getting started. Are you sure you want to know? That's a pretty messed up story, but I suppose we could count it as a part of your education. Maybe it'll help you avoid something that got me in a lot of hot water and canceled the Flat Stanley project for the whole school. I told her I did, pretty intrigued with what could have happened to make a whole school ban something as benign as a kid's art project. Well, you remember that we sent the little guy around to the school the next town over? Well, then they sent it to another school, and that school sent it to another school, and so on and so forth. We had about the best results out of any of the classes, getting back about twice as much material as is normal. I started integrating it into the curriculum, as you remember, and it was such a huge part of our class. I appreciated the material. Sometimes it's hard to keep kids' attention when they're that young, but Stanley really helped. Then one day, I arrived to find a new package had come the day before. She stopped, shivering a little as she watched the waves. Someone had sent our Flat Stanley back, and I was excited as I opened the envelope. We were starting fractions that day. At least we were supposed to, and I wanted to see if there was some way I could work fractions into the package. I would get my wish, but not in the way I wanted. I had reached into my pocket for a cigarette, and Miss Gazel asked if she could have one. I had never seen her smoke before, but as she inhaled that first mouthful, she closed her eyes and looked euphoric. Flat Stanley was supposed to go to Carter Wild Elementary School in Boise, but it appeared he had gone somewhere else. You're too young to remember it, but there was a pretty terrible person in the Midwest in the late 90s. He was picking up young women who were hitchhiking. The police would find them later after he was done with them. Somehow, he got our Flat Stanley and thought it would be funny to use him to taunt the police. He had murdered 5 girls that week. Her voice broke as she said it, the tip of the cigarette jittering as she spoke, and attached pictures of them to the Stanley he sent back. They were horrific, and as I spilled them out of my desk, I recognized what I had at once. She was shaking, and as I put my jacket around her, she smiled ruefully at me. You're a good kid, despite making me relive this. We knew that the kids in my class had all kinds of weird ideas about what had happened, but we also knew that none of you knew the truth. She took a long pull off the cigarette and let the ash dribble down. The first girl in the pictures was Ashley Manx. He had cut her chest open, the X going right between her breasts, and skinned her open like some kind of flower. Her face was set in the worst possible look you've ever seen, and right there in the middle of her chest was Flat Stanley. Your Flat Stanley. I thought I got it then, but Miss Gazel hadn't even gotten rolling yet. Then there was Frances Carmichael, the girl he took from the fair. She was looking for a ride, and he gave her one. He cut her arms and legs off while she was alive, burning the wounds closed with an iron so she'd bleed out slowly. Finally, he cut her throat, and after that, he put 1 foot from that flat Stanley in her teeth and took a picture. He was standing upright, her body on display, and her burnt nubs are something I still can't quite get out of my head. I'm sorry, I started, but she cut me off. No, you wanted to know, so let me get it out. It's like the confessional I used to go to when I was little. If I get it all out, maybe it won't haunt me as bad. He got Dawn Cambridge and Betsy Cambridge next, split their backs, and made a pair of blood angels out of them. He set Flat Stanley in the middle of them, the crevice between their sides, and snapped a picture. They were still looking for them when they found Ashley. Finally, he got Melanie Fasterly, and she was probably the worst. He beat her with a sledgehammer until her bones were like glass shards. The picture he sent back was unrecognizable as a human being. If it hadn't been for the hair, I would never have known what it was. He stood the cutout between her lumpy legs as if to save her modesty, and she honestly looked about as flat as he was, if you don't count all the bone spurs sticking out of her. Mrs. Gazzle was shaking, the shivering causing her to stutter over the last few words, and when she looked back at me, there was regret on her face. All the alcohol had been burned out of her, the fear having shaken it loose as her mind remembered what was likely the worst day of her life. I called the police, of course I did, but my real concern was for you guys. If this psycho had mailed this back to us, then he had the address of the school. If he knew where you were, then he could pay us a visit and make us his next photo collage, and I couldn't have lived with myself if that had happened. So I gave the police everything, and they agreed to keep an eye on the school for a while. I needn't have bothered. The twisted fuck had a particular hunting ground, and a particular prey, neither of which were children in Georgia. He never did pay us a visit, but it took 6 more girls before they caught him. I didn't sleep well until they had him in custody, and I didn't sleep soundly until they slipped the needle into his arm last year. He was a rotten, twisted individual, and he deserved every ounce of what he got. I had to take the rest of the week off to recover from his little present, and there was talk that they might want me to undergo counseling. When I got back, the school had scrapped all that Flat Stanley stuff. It was too much of a risk that some student would get a hold of it next. And they couldn't have that. Some of the teachers thought we should tell the students. Some of them thought we should tell the parents, and a few of them thought that I should be fired for some reason. It was decided that we wouldn't tell any of them, and we would never speak of it again. In exchange for not causing an uproar, I got to keep my job. I thought it was a pretty fitting trade back then. So that's the whole sad story. Cure your curiosity? It did. Mrs. Gazzle was right, too. They offered me a job at the end of my training, and it turned out it was her job. Mrs. Gazzle retired at the end of the year, wanting to spend more time with her grandkids and her daughters. We still get drinks sometimes, and she really is a lovely woman. As for me, I noticed one major part of the contract that I was presented with. They put it in bold so you couldn't possibly miss it, so if you break it, you really only have yourself to blame. Under no circumstances will our students participate in any program that sends documents to other schools or entities without the express permission of administration. This includes pen pal programs, Hands Across the Water, the Flat Stanley Project, and other affiliated projects there within. I signed that contract 10 years ago, and now I instruct student teachers myself. In the decade I've been teaching, I've never broken that rule, and I have Mrs. Gazzle's story to thank for that. When you send something like that out into the world, you never know who might answer back, and what they might have to say.